Hey, what's going on? This is James Kennedy and welcome back to the James Kennedy podcast. I just want to say a quick thanks to everybody for checking out the podcast so far and sharing it, leaving comments and subscribing and leaving ratings and reviews. I really appreciate it. It really helps the reach of the podcast, and it's also nice to know that these conversations are being enjoyed as well. Today, we are going to be talking about Israel and Palestine. Now, this is an issue that is intensely divisive. And anyone that follows me online knows where I stand on this particular issue because I've been very open and vocal about it many times. But I'm going to be giving the floor over today to our guest who is calling in live from Palestine, who is going to help us make some sense of what is oftentimes a very messy, complicated, and emotionally charged issue. And I hope that this chat is going to give you a good, compact hour's worth of information with some history and background as to why we're at where we are today, some possible solutions, and what you can do to help and get involved. Our guest today is on very tight time, so I'm going to get straight on with it. Dr. Yara Hawari is the Senior Policy Analyst at Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, as well as being a tireless campaigner for the Palestinian cause, an author and a political commentator. There is no one better to speak with us on today's issue than Yara, and I'm really thankful to her for giving us her time today. So calling in live from Palestine, Dr. Yara Hawari, how are you?
I'm very well. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
I'm glad to hear it, and thank you so much for giving us your time today. We really do appreciate it. Before we jump right into the issue, would it be possible to give the listeners just a quick overview of who you are and what it is that you do?
Yeah, sure. Well, as you mentioned, I'm an academic, writer, and policy analyst. I am Palestinian. I live in Palestine, but I also spent quite a long time in the UK studying secondary school and higher education in the UK. But now I'm back in Palestine.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you're well, because I know that it is a very intense time over there at the moment. And this is an issue, as I said, that is extremely divisive. So for the purposes of clarity and setting some context, would it be possible to get a brief sort of history lesson and getting some background onto why we're at where we're at today in Israel and Palestine?
Yeah, and I think it's as you said, it's such a divisive issue. And I think sometimes it's purposefully overcomplicated. So I'll try and provide a very succinct history. I think firstly, we have to identify correctly what is happening to the Palestinian people. This is not a conflict. We hear that time and time again in the mainstream media.
Yeah.
What's happening to the Palestinian people is a process of settler colonialism. So what is settler colonialism? Well, I think many people will probably be familiar with bog standard colonialism. An imperial power goes to another country, usually in the global south, and conquers it in order to exploit the land and the people for the profit and benefit of the imperial motherland. But with settler colonialism, it's different because the colonialists are seeking to settle, to create a new homeland exclusively for them. There's this Italian scholar called Lorenzo Veracini who explains this very well. He says that with colonialism, the colonialist says to the indigenous or the native, you work for me, whereas the settler colonialist says to the indigenous or the native, you go away. And some examples of settler colonial projects include the United States of America, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa and Algeria. And these latter two are actually, South Africa and Algeria, are considered examples where the settler colonial project was actually defeated. So we have to look at when Zionist settler colonialism began in Palestine. And this predates 1948, which is usually considered as the starting point. Zionism is understood as this political movement that calls for establishing a Jewish nation state in Palestine with a Jewish majority. But it's increasingly being understood by many scholars as a settler colonial movement. And if we go back to 1897, this was when the first Zionist Congress took place in Switzerland. And in this Congress, they established a program where they called for the establishing of a Jewish state in Palestine, and to begin coordinating the settlement of Zionists there. And this was what they would consider as a solution for the Jewish question. And of course, the Jewish question was the rise in anti-Semitism in Europe, pogroms, increasing alienation. Now, remember, this was before the Second World War.
Right.
And so this was seen as a solution to emancipate the Jewish people from persecution. And so the Zionist Congress was the first to organize and marshal the colonization efforts in a very centralized and effective way. But what was the issue? The issue was that Palestine was already inhabited. It wasn't an empty land. So the question of what to do with native Palestinian Arabs really animated the early discussions of the Zionist movement. But there was a general consensus that these people would have to be removed somehow, either through some kind of agreement or by force. But there was a consensus that there would be no way to establish a Jewish majority state in Palestine without displacing much of the native population. And you don't have to believe me or Palestinian academics that Zionism is a settler colonial movement. You can actually hear it from the horse's mouth. If you look at the writings of the early Zionist founding fathers, you see that they all talk about the Zionist movement as a colonial one. And you have to remember that this was a time when colonialism was a very accepted form of rule. So these founding fathers, including Herzl and Jabotinsky, were all talking about Zionism as a colonial movement with pride. And so fast forwarding a little bit, Palestine in the early 1900s was still under the Ottoman Empire's rule. And we know then that the Ottoman Empire was in decline and European powers started to eye up the region. And there were all kinds of different treaties and agreements that basically carved up the spoils of the Ottoman Empire, including in the Middle East, where we saw all these borders being drawn up that didn't exist before.
Yeah.
And this included the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916, which was basically Britain and France deciding what territories they wanted. No surprise there. And Britain wanted the land of Palestine, and they were granted it by the League of Nations as a mandate. Now, this mandate was basically a fancy way to describe a colonial entity. It was supposed to be a system in which Palestine would be prepared for eventual self-rule, but the reality was very different. We also saw in 1917 something called the Balfour Declaration.
Yeah.
And I mention it because it is an incredibly important document that a lot of Palestinians refer to when they talk about Britain's complicity in what happened in Palestine. The Balfour Declaration was a letter written by the British Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, to Lionel Walter Rothschild, a Zionist leader, in which he expressed the British government's support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Basically, he was giving away something that he had no right to give away. So the Zionist movement began settling Jewish settlers in Palestine during this period, the Mandate period. And the British actually greatly facilitated the build-up of Zionist institutions, the appropriation of Palestinian land. They incorporated a lot of the Zionist settlers into their administration because, of course, they were considered better, more trustworthy workers than the native Arabs. And of course, there was just a general affinity towards Zionist settlers more than there was to Palestinians who they were considered as, natives beneath them, uncivilized, etc. Now, the British were very unsuccessful in their ruling of the mandate in many ways. They were incredibly cruel to the Palestinian population. They terrorized the Palestinian population. They prevented the Palestinian population and society from flourishing. There was a great revolt in 1936, which is referred to in Arabic and by Palestinians as the Great Revolt. It was an uprising against British rule by Palestinians in which many Palestinians were killed. It was brutally crushed. But this was really, this 1936 uprising and the crushing of it really had very dire consequences over a decade later. we saw a lot of political leaders being assassinated, being arrested and hanged, weapons confiscated, basically a demobilization of the Palestinian armed resistance. And so it's no surprise that, over a decade later, in 1948, when the Zionist movement began taking over, that the Palestinians were completely unequipped to deal with what happened. So the British pulled out of the mandate in Palestine. They were really, according to their own standards, failing miserably, and they decided that they couldn't handle the situation between the Zionist settlers and the Palestinians, which was growing more tense and more violent by the day. And so they decided really to pull out just in one go. And there's a common saying among Palestinians that the British basically handed over the keys to the Zionist movement. Right. And that's really what they did. In many cases, they left their, weapons supplies and all their documents there for the taking. Now, just in the lead up, I should say, to 1948, which Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe, the Zionist movement was busy collecting information and intelligence on Palestinians and Palestinian localities in preparation for what they would consider the final war or the final push to conquer Palestine for themselves. So they were incredibly well equipped. And in 1948, that's really when, things started to kick off. The Zionist paramilitary forces began taking over more and more land, began expelling Palestinians from their homes and their villages. There were many massacres. It was a very organized plan to ethnically cleanse Palestine of its Palestinian population. And in the end, what we saw was nearly 500 Palestinian villages and towns being destroyed and depopulated. And around 800,000 Palestinians were expelled from their homeland beyond the borders of Palestine. And then there were hundreds of thousands more that were internally displaced. The Zionist movement declared independence in May in 1948, and they declared the establishment of the State of Israel. And this was the genesis of the Israeli settler colonial apartheid regime.
Right.
Now, the Zionist movement occupied not all of historic Palestine, but around 80% of historic Palestine. The areas which they were not able to occupy in 1948 is what's known today as the West Bank and Gaza. So in the 48 territories, and I'll keep referring to them as the 48 territories, these are the lands that were occupied by the Zionist movement, the 80% that was occupied in 1948. About 150,000 Palestinians survived the ethnic cleansing, and they were put into camps and ghettos. They were kept under lock and key in their villages, their surviving villages. And eventually they were given Israeli citizenship. But this was a second-class citizenship. They were actually placed under martial law for nearly 2 decades. And these are the people that is often referred to in mainstream media today as the Palestinian citizens of Israel. So in 1948, they were 150,000 that survived, and today they number nearly 2 million. So let's fast forward quickly to 1967. There's a lot of history to get through here, but these are important dates to talk about. 1967 is really the one that's always talked about in the mainstream media. It's often considered as the genesis of the conflict. And of course, what we've seen is that's not true at all. It actually began many decades before that. But the reason for that is because the international community recognized the Zionist movement's occupation of Palestine in 1948, and they recognized, for the most part, not all countries, but most of them did recognize the State of Israel. In 1967, there was what's known as the Six-Day War. in sort of mainstream historical records. And this was when Israel managed to occupy the rest of Palestine, i.e. the West Bank and Gaza, and even more. They also occupied the Syrian Golan and much of the Egyptian Sinai. And this is when they took over all of colonized Palestine. Now, the international community did not recognize that occupation. They said, no, this is a step too far. We are considering this as an illegal occupation, as an attempt to take over land that is not yours. And so that's why today you hear people referring to the occupied territories or the occupied 1967 territories.
Yeah.
These are the lands of the West Bank and Gaza. So a lot has happened since then, but I think we'll leave it there just for now, because that's a lot of history in one huge go.
No, that was absolutely brilliant. And thank you so much for condensing all of that into one compact, bite-sized chunk for us all. And that already throws up so many more questions. But being conscious of our time today, I wanted to skip ahead to present day and see if it's possible for you to give the listeners an insight into what is the daily reality of life like in Palestine today. For somebody who's just trying to go about their everyday activities, the sort of things that we might take for granted over here, just ordinary, normal civil life in Palestine. Could you describe what that is like?
I think we have to be a bit specific here, because Palestinians in Palestine face sort of different realities according to where they live and what IDs they have. Even though they're all oppressed under this one regime,
right,
there are different characteristics for different realities.
Right.
So Palestine has been fragmented into these various different territories or areas, the West Bank and Gaza, which are called the 67 territories. These are Palestinians which under international law are considered as under military occupation. They have, for the most part, Palestinian IDs. And then we have Palestinians in the 48 territories. These are Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. And then we have Palestinians in exile in refugee camps in neighboring countries and beyond.
Right.
So we can start with the West Bank. The West Bank has a population of 3 million, nearly 3 million people. It's a very small area of land. And it's under military occupation. And so what that looks like in day-to-day is, checkpoints, army raids, control over full Israeli control over natural resources, really absolute Israeli control over life. So within the sort of main urban centers, the main Palestinian urban centers, you move around, you might not think about the occupation because you don't see it so clearly. But as soon as you move outside of that city, you start seeing the military infrastructure of the Israeli regime. You can't get very far without coming to a checkpoint. Military raids, even in the Palestinian urban areas, are quite common.
Right.
You are governed by a military rule system, which basically makes nearly everything illegal. And I'm not even exaggerating here. There are military orders which deem any kind of political activity illegal. You can't be a member of a political party. You can't. A gathering of more than 10 people can be considered as a political rally.
Wow.
And of course, just going to one of the gathering or being a member of a political party doesn't mean that you'll be arrested. But the Israeli regime can use any of these things as a pretext to arrest you. And the carceral system that the Israeli regime maintains is incredibly brutal. Thousands of Palestinians are incarcerated every year. Usually those who are involved in political or social activities, NGO workers are also frequently incarcerated. And it's under a military system. So there isn't a civil court. If you are arrested, you are taken to a military court where the conviction rate is at 99.9%.
Jesus.
So if you get to court, for sure you are going to prison. And there are many different tactics that the Israeli regime uses to keep you indefinitely detained. So, for example, there's a practice called administrative detention, where the Israeli regime can say that they have secret information on you that they can't release because of the security of the state. So they just keep you under indefinite detention. And this can, go on for years and years and years. And most Palestinians know someone, either a close relative or a close friend, who is in prison. And I think since 1967, over something like 1 million Palestinians have been in prison. So it's a huge part of Palestinian life in the West Bank and Gaza. Now, in Gaza, the situation, and of course I shouldn't talk about the settlements. Now, the settlements in the West Bank, these are what the international community refer to as illegal settlements. They are Israeli settlements built in the West Bank on Palestinian land, and there are hundreds of them, and the number of illegal settlers now, I think, is about 600,000 illegal settlers in the West Bank, including in East Jerusalem. Now, the settlements aren't just these, small encampments. They are essentially cities and towns that are built illegally, that take resources away from Palestinians. The Israeli regime controls all the natural resources in the West Bank, and even takes the water and then sells it back to the Palestinians. So the settlements also control the major agricultural fertile lands. So the Jordan Valley, which is a highly fertile region or area of land for produce, is essentially completely under Israeli control. So these settlements really impinge on every aspect of Palestinian life. There are also settler-only roads in the West Bank. So if you're a Palestinian, you're not allowed to go on those roads. It just cuts through, these settlements just cut up the West Bank, and the West Bank isn't this contiguous geographic territory. It's really the small pockets or bantustans, for the lack of a better word, of where sort of Palestinians live, completely deprived compared to Jewish Israeli settlers who might live just down the road.
Yeah.
And Palestinians, even the getting from point A to B is a nightmare. I mean, it sounds really mundane, but Palestinians are funneled onto these tiny roads, and so the traffic is really unbearable. So, it's all about controlling Palestinian movement and slowing Palestinians down so that they're not, going from place to place so frequently, that they're really sort of encased in these small areas and small pockets.
Would you say that it's fair to compare it to life in apartheid South Africa?
So apartheid is legally defined as a system of segregation in order to maintain dominance by one group over another. And it's become a system of control that's been, enshrined within international law. So it doesn't have to look like South Africa for it to be apartheid. And I think that's really important because, Palestinians and advocates often talk about, this is like South Africa, this is apartheid. And whilst there are many similarities, there are also many differences. But those differences don't mean that it's not apartheid. Apartheid is quite simply, and, there is, an international law definition which establishes that it's the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court actually defines it as inhumane acts in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over any other racial group or groups committed with the intent of maintaining that regime.
Right.
So this is a definition that can be universally applicable.
I think so.
And so it can adopt a lot of different characteristics. And so, yes, there are many similarities with the South African apartheid regime, but there were also many differences, and in some situations, differences that make it a lot worse.
Yeah.
And this is obviously also not to compare to, say one people's suffering is worse than another's, but there are many shared and many different characteristics. And many human rights groups now have actually come out and said that the Israeli regime is practicing apartheid on the Palestinian people, including Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch,
right.
and others, and Palestinian scholars and activists have been saying it for a lot longer than these human rights groups. But in my belief, and in the belief of many scholars and organizations, it is an apartheid regime. And you can just look at the other. It's not just in the West Bank that Israel practices apartheid on the Palestinian people. So if we look at Gaza, for example, Gaza is considered one of the largest outdoor prisons in the world. It's an area, I think it's around 365 kilometers squared, a very small area, and there are 2.1 million people packed into this area. And of those 2.1, 1.4 million of them are actually refugees from other areas in Palestine. And Israel has placed it under siege for a decade and a half. And what that means is that it has completely closed off all of its borders. It controls all of its land, sea, and air borders. And so if anyone wants to leave Gaza, they have to do so with permission from the Israeli regime. And they've also placed it under blockade. So that means that also nothing goes in or goes out without Israeli approval. We're talking, food, medical supplies, building supplies, all of that has to come through with the permission of Israel.
Yeah.
And on top of that, as if things weren't bad enough in Gaza, this densely populated area of land, Israel has also subjected it to very intense military bombardments. There have been 4 wars since 2008 in Gaza, 4 really brutal wars. So that means, a child of, 15 has seen 4 wars in their lifetime. And we're talking about, wars in which the Israeli regime essentially drops bombs on this very densely populated area under the pretext of wanting to attack Hamas, the Palestinian political party that is in government in Gaza. So the situation there is very, very difficult. The UN actually deemed Gaza to be unlivable by 2020. We're now in 2022, and the situation is really, really tough. Just from the basics of not having, electricity 24 hours a day. And they only have electricity a few hours a day. And not only does that, affect hospitals and life support machines and, but just basic, daily living, your refrigerator, your laptops, your television, all of these things, you have to arrange your life, schedule your life around these periods of electricity. And water in Gaza is undrinkable. There is barely any drinkable water in Gaza. So it's a really, really bad situation, and it's not a humanitarian crisis. It's often referred to as a humanitarian crisis, as if this sort of just happened on its own. It's a political crisis. There is a decision being made by the Israeli regime to place these 2 million people, under siege and blockade. And that could be lifted tomorrow if there was the political will to do so. But the Israeli regime doesn't want to do so. It wants to punish the Palestinian population in Gaza. And it's a big business as well. It's a big aid and development business, and which is, and I think it's a whole other podcast on its own, critique of aid and development. And just very quickly, just to talk about the 48 territories, those are the Palestinian citizens of Israel, who are also about nearly 2 million people. These are the people that were occupied in 1948. Now, whilst they have Israeli citizenship, it's really, a fourth, fifth level citizenship. They do not have access to all the things that Jewish Israelis have access to. They're treated as this sort of enemy from within. They live very separate and segregated lives from Jewish Israeli counterparts. The areas in which they live in are deeply under-resourced. Right. Also look very similar to ghettos and Bantustans. And then in exile, there are millions of Palestinians in exile who either live in refugee camps in bordering right. countries in very difficult conditions, in which they're not granted citizenship and basically have no papers. In many situations, these refugees have been made refugees once again because of the war in Syria or the dire situation in Lebanon. So the reality for Palestinians, wherever they live, is a very abnormal one.
Yeah.
It's one that's full of oppression and tragedy, but it's also one that's sort of survival. The fact that Palestinians still exist in all these fragments and yes. still call themselves Palestinian, I think is a testament to the Palestinian people's will to survive.
Definitely. No, definitely. It's a truly heartbreaking situation, and it's heartbreaking to witness it from afar as well, particularly if you're aware that the mainstream media's projection of this is so heavily propagandized and biased in favor of Israel. And one of the things that we hear about so much over here as a solution is the two-state solution that is often presented as the only workable option at this point. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that as a Palestinian. Is the two-state solution the only solution at this point? Is it a workable, practical solution, a realistic solution? And is it a solution that the Palestinians would actually be okay with?
So the two-state solution is something that was forced upon the Palestinian people as a compromise, as something that they would have to accept as, if they wanted to achieve any rights. And so the Palestinian leadership, for better or worse, accepted that compromise and pursued negotiations within that framework of two states. So the idea would be that there would be a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, and that the Israeli state would be in the 48 territories, bearing in mind that this is a massive compromise. This is, Palestinians saying, okay, we'll take a state on, less than 20% of our original homeland. And so the international community has been, working off this framework as a sort of basis for negotiations. And there were the famous Oslo Accords in the early 1990s, which basically were a series of agreements, interim agreements that would lead up to the establishment of a Palestinian state. That didn't happen. When you read actually the sort of the small print of the Oslo Accords and you analyze it with hindsight, you realize that this was a massive mistake, that the Palestinian leadership signed on to this, and that this was really allowed for the entrenchment of further Israeli domination and control. And I think for many Palestinians, the two-state solution has been, if they ever accepted it, and many Palestinians did not accept it, that it has been dead in the water for a very long time. But because the international community is really powerless in this situation, they are not able to hold Israel accountable to the violations it commits against the Palestinian people, nor are they able to hold them to their word with various agreements being signed and negotiated. And so the international community, for the lack of being able to do anything, keeps on sort of flogging this dead horse that, two-state solution, right, and promoting it as this sort of the most feasible and the most rational solution, when in actual reality, it addresses very little of Palestinians' desires and hopes for sovereignty and fundamental rights. So, no, I don't think, and I have never thought, that the two-state solution is a just option or a viable option. Essentially, it's partition.
Yeah.
It's creating yet another border in a region which is full of colonial borders. And for me, another one is not the answer.
Yeah.
I think, when it comes down to it, Palestinians can summarize what they want, very simply. Like, they want their fundamental rights. They want to be able to live as any other people live in the world, really, even more basic than that. I think if you asked any Palestinian on the street, they would, just want to be able to move. They would want to be able to go to the sea. Most Palestinians live within 45 minutes of the sea, and they are not allowed to go there. It's deeply sad, and it's these very small things that actually make life very, very difficult. And so an end to those, those deprivations, and end to those violations, a realization of fundamental rights, including ending the military occupation of the 67 lands, including the right of return for refugees, which is really fundamental to the Palestinian struggle, and full and equal citizenship for the Palestinian citizens of Israel. And these three things that I just mentioned are not a big ask. Actually, no. They are the minimal.
Yeah.
They are fully within international law, and I'm sure Palestinians. I can't speak for all Palestinians, but I know that Palestinians will have other demands as well, including reparations and justice and accountability, and those are incredibly important. But I think when you think about it, all of these things are completely reasonable demands and completely fall within international law, and yet Palestinians, when they talk about them, are often sort of disregarded as being sort of fantastical, asking for too much, when Palestinians have already compromised so much.
100%, yeah, 100%. And essentially what you're saying is, despite, any kind of political showboating or whatever that's going on between the West and Israel, essentially what Palestinians want is human rights, civil rights, justice, equality, and dignity, just like everybody else.
Yeah, and our political rights as well, and our political rights as a collective. I definitely don't want to play down the fact that Palestinians also want their political rights. But I think when you summarize it like that, it seems completely reasonable. And what's unreasonable is when they say, "Oh, well, the Israeli regime would never accept that." Well, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that the Israeli regime will not accept that. These are enshrined rights within international law, within the realms of what's accepted as moral and ethical. These are not tall demands. These are not big demands. No. And if there is an abusive regime, of course they don't want to give us that, of course, because it means that it would end their position of dominance and power.
Yeah.
But tough shit. Sorry for the language. But, this is what we have to demand of all violating and abusive regimes.
100%. And what are the obstacles then to achieving that in Palestine?
Well, there are big obstacles. Now, it's very unfortunate for the Palestinian people that the Israeli regime is very important to Western powers for multiple reasons.
Yeah, right.
The Western powers were so supportive of the establishment of Israel because basically it saw it as this, imperial sort of lookout post in the Middle East.
Lieutenant.
Exactly, an ally state that they could have watching the naughty Arabs.
Yeah.
And the Israeli regime, since then has evolved into this powerhouse of weapons and security technologies. And they have their hand in training so many different countries in their securities. They have their hand in, in selling weapons to so many countries around the world. It's really become, one of the most important regimes or countries in that regard.
Right.
And what the Israeli regime does is that it develops these weapons and security technologies, and it tests them on the Palestinians. The Palestinian people, the West Bank and Gaza, are these laboratories for the Israeli regime. They test these weapons out on us, and then they sell them to a global market. And their tech is really, it's first class, and I think it's pretty unbeatable. I think Israel is described as this sort of startup nation, as one of the most tech-savvy nations. Well, among that technology is also, surveillance and spyware, which it sells to regimes, to other regimes in the region and beyond. Really nasty regimes, which also use those technologies to spy and oppress their own people.
Yeah.
So Israel has become a very important player for a lot of countries around the world. And so protecting its interests is of global concern. So in this way, it can seem quite overwhelming. And I think I can understand why people might feel defeatist.
Yeah.
Because this is just such a big thing to take on. We're not just talking about the Israeli regime, we're talking about the whole weapons industry, the whole, surveillance industry, etc. But then if you sort of flip it on its head and you think about, right, well, these regimes are oppressing millions of people, and the potential for solidarity and cross-movement mobilizing is huge. So it doesn't just become about Palestine. It's about, a global bottom-up movement to challenge and stop the arms trade, which Israel, of course, plays a key role.
Yeah.
So that's when I feel a bit overwhelmed, that's what I always remind myself, that this is, okay, they are big, they are powerful, but they're also oppressing millions of us, not just in Palestine, but elsewhere. And so we are a lot more than them. So we do have, in that sense, the people power. And so, I think that's just one of the obstacles we're facing. I think, I think also that there are internally with the Palestinians, there's a lot of internal obstacles. Our own leadership is one of the biggest obstacles.
Right.
Not many people are aware that the Palestinian Authority leadership is a very corrupt and authoritarian leadership, which does a lot of is considered by a lot of people a subcontractor for the Israeli regime.
Right.
It's not particularly unusual in colonial situations that the colonial power will recruit a sort of local or native police force to do its dirty work. And that's really the case that has happened in Palestine. So there is also, an internal problem with leadership, with mobilization.
Yeah.
But again, I think it's all connected, and that's by design. Many of our political leaders are revolutionary political leaders are in prison or have been assassinated. So it serves their interest to put in a leadership that will be subservient and that will keep the Palestinian population subdued.
There were so many points there that you just made that I would love to embellish further upon, but I know that time is against us. I totally agree, though, that hope can be derived from the fact that this struggle is connected to so many other struggles around the world. I think there is a lot of hope to be derived from that, because it means that people in countries such as mine in the UK or in the US and Canada or France or wherever it may be, we can do our part in that struggle. Whether it's campaigning against the arms industries that profit from this, or lobbying our governments who support this, it makes the fight so much more global. And in those terms, the Palestinian struggle now has millions and millions of allies all around the world. And I think a lot of hope can be drawn from that. So practically speaking, what can people listening to this from countries around the world who are motivated to get involved and help, What can they do that would be useful?
Well, I think two things really. I think firstly to join or be part of local Palestine solidarity movements, whether that's BDS groups, BDS standing for Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions,
Yeah.
movement groups, or just general Palestine solidarity groups, wherever you are, and to really focus on linking these groups up with other social justice and political struggles, because as we just talked about, they are so connected, and they are inherently connected to one another. But the second thing, and I think this is is quite frequently understated. Palestine won't be liberated whilst we have all the governments and regimes that are currently in place. It is within the interest of capitalist and right-wing regimes that Israel, exists as it does, as an apartheid state, as a settler colonial project. And so it means that there has to be a global shift in politics, that people have to work wherever they are in changing their politics to a more progressive, to a more left-wing one, to one that is more focused around social justice and has an emancipatory politics, emancipatory global politics. So, if you are somewhere that doesn't have, a Palestine solidarity group or a BDS group, you could start one, but you could also work, hard on making sure that your local government or the national government, wherever you are, is one that is more friendly to the Palestinian struggle for liberation,
right. Yep.
that adopts a political agenda that is not just about, obviously not just focused on Palestine, but that includes Palestine as part of a progressive, progressive package, political package that addresses, climate change, that addresses Palestine, that addresses indigenous rights, etc. So I think, people shouldn't be overwhelmed by the fact that they are far away and they might not know what to do. Palestine is connected. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. And the Palestinian people are a diasporic people. We do exist in a lot of places around the world. And it's not hard to find some of us. So I think there are plenty of opportunities for people to get involved and work for work towards the liberation of Palestine. And there is a lot going on online as well. The BDS movement website has a lot of really useful resources. There are a lot of student groups. So if you're a student, undoubtedly on your campus, there is a Palestine solidarity group. So there's a lot of things that can be done, but I don't want people to feel overwhelmed that it's just too much. I think that's also not to be complacent. I think, in this day and age, we have to be very careful with complacency, and, social media posting is not enough. It doesn't quite cut it anymore.
Yeah.
It has to be accompanied with direct political action. But I think, I think we are becoming more connected to one another, and I think our struggles are linking up. So I do think there is plenty of opportunity.
Yeah, and there are countless Palestine solidarity groups around the world as well. So wherever you are listening to this from, there will be a group local to you that you can get involved with. Another thing I wanted to ask you was, what role do the citizens of Israel play in this, and can they be a part of the solution?
Well, I think for any settler colonial nation, there has to be a deep process of unlearning. These are people that have been conditioned to believe that their dominance over another group is justified and is right. So I think it's a deep process of unlearning, and it has to be a collective one. It's not just good enough that one person becomes an anti-Zionist. It has to be really a collective process. So it's doing that, working on your own society. And there are, in South Africa, there were white Afrikaners that were part of the anti-apartheid struggle, and there were also white Afrikaners that worked on educating the white population. But it wasn't, it wasn't a huge part of the struggle in the sense that that's what the struggle relied upon, changing the minds of the settler colonial. Right. Essentially, what the downfall of apartheid in South Africa was because it came under massive pressure from the outside and the international community with sanctions.
Yeah.
So I think that's, I think that we cannot wait for Israeli society to wake up and realize what they're doing.
Right.
I think it has to come from the outside, because when that pressure is applied, I think, they'll go through that process a lot quicker.
But we've done it before. We've seen it time and time again, haven't we? So we know it is possible. And as bleak as it seems, and it does seem, looking in from the outside, as if things are getting worse, with the continued expansions into the occupied territories. And obviously, I wanted to touch more today on, we haven't got time, but the shooting recently of Shireen Abu Akleh and the disgraceful display that we saw at her funeral procession. It does oftentimes seem as if things are getting worse. But as you alluded to earlier, there's the human spirit and that strength of spirit within the Palestinian people that has fought for so long now. So there is hope. And as you say, awareness, we are in a globally connected world now. The awareness around the world on this issue is growing stronger by the day. So if everybody does their bit, I think that there is hope that, we can see a better day.
Yeah, and I think, I'm glad that you mentioned Shireen Abu Akleh, because that was a really, really, it was shocking and it was not shocking. It was shocking because we all entered as a nation into sort of collective grief and mourning, but it wasn't surprising. And I know the international community was deeply surprised, but, it's because it received attention. Shireen was a well-known, journalist known around the Arab world. She had an international platform. But she's not the first journalist to be assassinated and killed. She wasn't the last. There has already been another journalist that has been killed since her. So I think moments like this are important to highlight the ongoing system of or the ongoing violence here that's committed by the Israeli regime. And again, the beating of the coffin bearers at her funeral, it was horrific to see.
It was.
But again, it wasn't, for Palestinians, it wasn't surprising. Like we're not surprised by what they do anymore because they have done so much to us. But I think moments like that are important. And I think that there is, the public opinion on the Israeli regime is shifting. It's becoming very hard to defend actions like that. And I think, it's important that people stay engaged.
I completely agree. Well, Yara, I know you've got to go. So as much as I want to keep you talking, I know I've got to let you go. So thank you so much for giving us your time today. I know how incredibly busy you are. And thank you for everything you're doing on this issue as well. This is such a crucial issue on the world stage. And I hope you'll come and speak with us again sometime. But in the meantime, stay safe and stay strong.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Anytime at all. We'll speak to you soon. Thanks again, Yara. Bye-bye.
Bye.
There you go. I really hope you found that informative and interesting. I mean, Yara knows everything there is to know on this issue, and she was absolutely brilliant at condensing so much history and background down into those 10-minute bite-sized chunks for us to digest. She was on a tight time slot because she had another interview lined up right after this one. But for those of you who don't know much or enough about this issue, I'm hoping that now, after listening to the past hour, that you've got a much broader and deeper understanding of exactly what's happening over in Palestine. And usually I tend to rant and riff at the end of these things and put my own 10 cents in. But I'm not going to do that this week because there's nothing I can say that's going to embellish or amplify what Yara has already said. And I don't feel that it's my place to try and do that. If after listening to that you'd like to get more involved in this cause, there are tons of groups that you can check out. Here in the UK, there's a group that I've done a few things with in the past called the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. There's also Pal Action. And you can check out some of the BDS groups as well, which stands for Boycott, Divest and Sanction. And you can follow Yara directly on Twitter at Yara Hawari. I really hope that after listening to that, you will be motivated to get involved in this cause, because it is such a heartbreaking struggle that just does not need to happen and should not be happening. Thanks again for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, and I shall see you next week, same time, same place. Don't forget to subscribe, share, leave a rating, leave a review, leave a comment. I'll see you next week. Love you guys. Cheers.